The faded scrubs hung loose on her frame, deliberately 2 sizes too large. Elena Martinez had spent 3 years perfecting the unremarkable, the shuffle instead of stride, the downcast eyes during rounds, the way she made herself smaller in doorways. Seattle General in Colorado Springs didn't hire legends. It hired nurses who filled shifts and asked no questions. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as she moved through the corridors at 6:53 a.m., her badge clipped to a lanyard instead of pinned where it belonged, her dark hair pulled into the kind of bun that suggested no one had taught her how to look professional. She had taught herself to look invisible. It was harder than combat. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular despair of a hospital at that hour, stale from the night shift, not yet refreshed by morning optimism. Elena sat alone at the corner table with a cup of black coffee that she didn't drink, her hands wrapped around it for warmth and cover. Her knuckles bore thin white scars that told stories no one here would ever read. She opened her worn leather wallet, the one she kept in her scrub pocket, never in her locker, and looked at the photograph inside. A young man in Special Forces dress uniform, his arm around a boy of 7. Her son. James Martinez Jr. The boy was 13 now. The man in the photograph had come home in a flag-draped box 2 years ago. She touched the photo once, exactly once, the way she had every morning for 847 days, and closed the wallet without letting anyone see. That was when Dr. Pierce entered. He moved the way powerful men move in hospitals, like the building had been designed around his convenience, like the laws of physics bent slightly in his favor. His lab coat was pristine white, his loafers Italian leather, his watch a Rolex that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. He was 48 years old, the son of a congressman, and had never in his life encountered a question he couldn't answer with confidence and a smile. He saw her sitting alone at that corner table in those deliberately unremarkable scrubs, and something in her posture caught his eye. Not her face. He didn't bother with faces of nurses. But her spine was straight. Her shoulders were level. There was a precision to the way she held that coffee cup, as if even her hands were obeying orders. He didn't see what was underneath. He saw only the surface, and the surface told him, competent but unremarkable. No Ivy League degree. Probably a state school, if that. Local hire, no connections, no sponsors in the department. The kind of nurse who would follow orders without thinking, who would defer to his judgment without question, who would serve as a perfect example of the hospital hierarchy to the residents and interns who trailed behind him like pilot fish. He felt the familiar satisfaction of knowing exactly who she was before she'd ever spoken a word. That feeling, that certainty, would cost him everything. But he didn't know that yet. "Morning, Doctor," Elena said without looking up, her voice soft and even. She didn't make the mistake of meeting his eyes. That was important. Invisible people didn't make eye contact. He didn't respond. He simply nodded at the empty chair across from her, a gesture of permission rather than invitation, and poured himself coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the warmer for approximately 3 hours. The nurse, he would never learn her name, not really, not in the way that mattered, was already forgotten. There were rounds to make. There were residents to impress. There were protocols to enforce and nurses to remind of their place in the hierarchy. What Dr. Pierce didn't know was that Elena Martinez had spent the previous morning reviewing the classified file on the patient in room 347. What he didn't know was that her hands had never trembled during a code because she had run field hospitals under mortar fire in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province. What he didn't know was that the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one visible only when she unzipped it in the locker room at 5 a.m. before anyone arrived, bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. What he didn't know was that the woman sitting alone in the break room in those deliberately unremarkable scrubs was Captain Elena Martinez, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart twice over, and she was here on orders from the Pentagon. The military doesn't waste soldiers on surveillance. It wastes them on nothing at all. When the Department of Defense needs to monitor a patient with classified exposure, it sends its best. Elena had been given one assignment: watch Captain James Martinez in room 347. Track his recovery. Note any emerging memories related to the bioweapon exposure in Helmand Province that had cost him his voice and nearly cost him his life. Report only to her handler, a voice on a classified number that rang into a Pentagon extension that officially didn't exist. Maintain deep cover. Tell no one. Risk assessment, critical. Compromise protocol, remove yourself immediately from the hospital and do not return. She had memorized every word of the briefing. She had burned the document in the sink of a gas station bathroom in Cheyenne. The ashes had dissolved in water that smelled like rust and rain. Room 347 was at the end of the eastern corridor, past the medication station, through the double doors that required a badge swipe. Elena had walked that route 1,847 times. She knew the exact squeak of the third tile from the left. She knew that the fluorescent light above the medication station flickered at 47-second intervals. She knew that Captain Martinez woke at precisely 6:15 a.m., when the hospital began to stir, and that he watched the door with the kind of alertness that survived even when the voice did not. She pushed the door to room 347 open at 7:02 a.m., exactly 4 minutes before Dr. Pierce and his entourage would begin morning rounds. Captain Martinez was sitting up in bed, his hospital gown replaced with pajamas that Elena had brought from home. They violated protocol, but she had done worse for less. His eyes, when they met hers, carried the weight of recognition. Not recognition of who she was, but recognition of what she was. A warrior disguised as a nurse. A ghost wearing scrubs. "Morning, Captain," Elena said softly, moving to check his vitals with a precision that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with muscle memory. "How's the pain today?" He couldn't answer with words. His voice box had been damaged beyond surgical repair in the same explosion that had killed 6 men under his command. But his eyes moved to the left once, meaning manageable. His right hand lifted slightly, meaning the bandages on his chest needed changing. Elena nodded without writing anything down. She would remember. Her memory was indexed by coordinates and call signs and the weight of bodies she had carried out of fire zones. She was adjusting his for a 20-gauge angiocath, saline flush, flow rate maintained at 75 milliliters per hour, when she heard the doors open at the far end of the corridor. The entourage had begun its rounds. Footsteps. The percussion of authority. Dr. Pierce's voice, loud and confident, explaining something to a resident about the importance of clinical precision. Elena's hands didn't change rhythm. Her breathing didn't shift. But something inside her crystallized, a quality of attention that transformed her completely, the way a tiger's spine straightens when it hears the sound of prey. She finished Captain Martinez's vitals in exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds. She documented everything in his chart using the medical terminology of a war surgeon: neuroassessment, cardiac stability, pulmonary function, with annotation so precise and unusual that a careful reader might wonder if this particular nurse had training beyond a bachelor's degree and state certification. But no one read carefully. No one ever did. The doors burst open at 7:18 a.m. Dr. Pierce entered with 5 residents trailing behind him like ducklings, their white coats still crisp from dry cleaning, their faces still soft with the certainty of people who had never seen anyone die. Elena was preparing the medication cart, organizing syringes and vials with the kind of methodical precision that belonged in an operating theater, not a patient room. She didn't look up. That was crucial. Invisible people didn't announce their presence. "Captain Martinez," Dr. Pierce said, his voice the sound of a man who had never been told no, ever, in his entire life. "How are we feeling this morning?" Martinez's eyes moved once to the left. Dr. Pierce nodded as if this answer had been audible, as if silence wasn't a kind of language all its own. He began to examine the patient with the bored competence of a man doing a routine task. His stethoscope was cold. His hands were steady but not kind. He asked questions that required yes or no answers, then answered them himself before giving Martinez a chance to respond through the elaborate eye signal system that Elena had taught him over 3 weeks of morning visits. Dr. Pierce didn't notice. But Elena noticed that he was about to order a medication that would interact poorly with Martinez's existing regimen. She noticed that he had misread the cardiac monitor. She noticed that he was treating a symptom instead of addressing the underlying metabolic issue. She noticed all of these things and said nothing, because invisible people don't correct doctors in front of residents. Invisible people nod and comply and follow orders without question. Invisible people know their place. But her hands moved on their own, subtle as prayer. She placed the correct medication at the top of the cart. She positioned herself so her body blocked access to the wrong dosage. She documented the anomalies in the chart with clinical language that would create a paper trail, protection in layers. Muscle memory had taken over, not the muscle memory of a nurse, but the muscle memory of a captain who had saved 43 lives under sustained enemy fire. Dr. Pierce finished his examination and turned to leave, already dismissing Captain Martinez as a routine case, a boring patient, a body in a bed that had nothing to teach him. His residents trailed behind. The moment he reached the door, Elena spoke. "Doctor?" Her voice was soft. Deferential. The voice of a woman without credentials. "His medications, should I verify the interaction with his?" "The medications are fine," Dr. Pierce said without turning around. He didn't even pause. "Just administer what's written in his chart, nurse. That's your job." The word hung in the air like smoke. Nurse. Not Elena. Not Martinez. Not Captain. Just the title, empty and infinite, a box to be filled and forgotten. She nodded silently and turned back to the medication cart. Captain Martinez's eyes tracked the doctor's exit, then found hers. In that moment, looking at her across the room with the comprehension of a man who recognized rank when he saw it, his face registered something that looked almost like sorrow. He had known her son. He had carried James Jr. out of Helmand Province in his own arms when the ambush came down. He had tried to save him. He had failed. And now here she was, a ghost in scrubs, doing invisible work that no one would ever see. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Elena's coffee had gone cold hours ago. And at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Colorado Springs, Dr. Pierce asked a question that would, by the end of the week, bring federal agents into his office and handcuffs onto his wrists. He was rounding on the next patient, joking with his residents about the importance of elite institutions, when he paused outside room 347 and said it loud enough for Elena to hear. "And where exactly did you train, Nurse Martinez?" Room 347 smelled like antiseptic and fear. Elena was checking the patient's oxygen saturation when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his shadow falling across the bed like a calculation he'd already finished making. The cardiac patient, a 64-year-old construction foreman named Morrison, lay propped at 45 degrees, his wife holding one hand and their daughter the other. Elena's gloved fingers were already moving. Pressure on the chest. A listen at the left mid-axilla. The telltale absence of breath sounds that made her spine straighten with recognition. Muffled heart tones despite the ventilator's steady work. The jugular veins distending with each breath, a pressure gradient building like water behind a dam that was about to fail. "Cardiac tamponade," Elena said quietly. Not to Dr. Pierce. To the monitors. To the room. To the only audience that mattered, the vital signs screaming what this body was trying to communicate. Requires immediate echo. Possible urgent pericardiocentesis. Dr. Pierce's face had already reddened. Not from exertion. From the specific color a man gets when his authority is questioned by someone he decided was beneath questioning. "Nurse Martinez," he said, his voice wrapped in a smile that wasn't one. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone here why 3 months of online classes makes you qualified to diagnose conditions I somehow managed to miss." The family exchanged the uncomfortable glances of people suddenly aware they'd become an audience to something larger than their relative's medical crisis. Mrs. Morrison's grip on her husband's hand tightened. The daughter's eyes moved between Elena and Dr. Pierce like she was watching two predators establish territory. Elena took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in Helmand Province, outside a aid station taking small arms fire, when the person in front of you was bleeding out and emotions were a luxury your hands couldn't afford. She'd learned that breath while holding a man's open chest cavity, while calling out pressures and medications with the clipped authority of someone whose next word might be the difference between a body bag and a stretcher. But she was just a nurse now. She had to be. The cover demanded it. One tear escaped her left eye. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk, quiet enough that only he could hear it, resonant enough that everyone in the room felt it land. "I know my job, Doctor." Pierce's jaw clenched. He turned away, but not before Elena saw something worse than anger in his face. She saw a man recognizing that his public humiliation hadn't worked. That fear wouldn't work. That she'd absorbed his words like water into sand, and he could see her still standing. He wrote the write-up right there in the room, his pen stabbing the paper as if the page had personally insulted him. Exceeding scope of practice. Insubordination. His signature looked like violence. Mrs. Morrison's daughter was staring at Elena now with the expression of someone watching a woman absorb catastrophe and remain vertical. The break room 3 days later was a different kind of battlefield, fluorescent lights humming overhead like something that had learned to mimic the sound of normalcy. Elena sat at the table with her lunch tray, a turkey sandwich she wouldn't taste and coffee she didn't need, when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a man who'd been waiting for the moment when enough people were present. He leaned against the frame, one hand in his pocket, speaking just loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I did some checking on our nurse know-it-all here. Interesting gaps in her employment history. Makes you wonder what she was really doing those years." A pause. A smile. Makes you wonder if those credentials are even real. The room changed. Elena could feel it the way she'd felt pressure changes before sandstorms in Kandahar, a shift in the air that happened at molecular level before human beings consciously registered it. Within 60 seconds, 4 nurses stood. Their lunch tray scraped against the table. One, Katie, who'd worked 2 shifts with Elena without incident, whispered to another, low enough that Pierce wouldn't hear it clearly but loud enough that Elena would. "I heard her certifications might be fake. Someone's running a background check." They left. One after another, the break room emptied until Elena sat alone at a table meant for 8, slowly eating mechanically like a machine programmed to sustain itself regardless of input. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. The coffee tasted like the specific loneliness that comes from watching people decide you're contagious. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She ate every bite. The morning huddle was worse because it was public in a way the break room hadn't been. 20 staff members present. Residents. Attending physicians. Support staff. Dr. Pierce stood near the unit board with his write-up already posted, a formal sheet of paper with his signature and typed allegations that looked professional enough to be true. He read aloud. His voice was all clinical concern, all reasonable authority protecting the institution from liability. Repeated insubordination. Concerning gaps in employment history. Practicing beyond scope of professional nursing licensure. Each charge was a nail. Each pause was the sound of a hammer finding purchase. Some people think confidence can substitute for credentials, he continued, making direct eye contact with her across the room. It cannot. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a group of people collectively realizes they've been watching a public execution. Elena stood perfectly still, absorbing the words the way a trauma surgeon absorbs shrapnel, cataloging impact points, calculating trajectory, assessing what might be survivable. She took one measured breath. The same breath. The one that had sustained her through 3 tours, through training, through watching men die in spaces too small for dignity. When she spoke, her voice dropped an octave. Not louder. Deeper. The kind of voice that comes from somewhere behind the sternum where will lives. I've served alongside men who face death with more grace than you face a woman who knows her job. The room froze. Pierce's smile faltered for exactly 1 second, the second it took him to realize the nurse he'd been demolishing had just responded with something that wasn't defense. It was indictment. But he recovered quickly. Served? Where exactly? Because I called your references, and those numbers don't even ring. It was a good lie. Designed to land. Designed to make everyone in the room question which story was true, the official record or the man's claim that he'd verified it and found nothing there. Elena didn't respond. She simply turned and walked toward room 347, her shoulders squared, her scrubs moving like water, her badge catching fluorescent light as she passed through the corridor. The staff watched her go. Some with pity. Some with doubt. Some with the specific expression people get when they're watching someone disappear. Captain James Martinez was waiting in room 347. The mute veteran Elena had been assigned to monitor without knowing that monitoring meant something entirely different than the Pentagon had explained. He couldn't speak. 3 pieces of shrapnel lodged against his larynx, the doctors had said. Inoperable risk. But he could see. His eyes followed hers as she entered, and for the first time since she'd been assigned to this rotation, Elena saw recognition flash across his face. Not of her. Of what she was. He'd been there in Helmand Province. He'd been in the unit. He knew. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would arrive exactly 41 minutes later, when Dr. Pierce would stumble into the physician's lounge and everything Elena had built over 3 years would collapse into a choice between letting a man die and becoming visible. The hospital's announcement came over the overhead speaker at 2:43 p.m. Code Silver, Code Silver. Active threat reported in parking structure, 2nd floor. This is not a drill. All personnel implement lockdown protocol immediately. Elena was restocking the crash cart when she heard the sound, not the announcement, but the thud that came 12 minutes after it. A heavy, wet sound from the physician's lounge. The sound of something significant hitting the floor. 2 residents froze in the hallway. Elena was already moving toward the sound, her hands already knowing what they would find before her eyes confirmed it. Dr. Pierce was on the floor, his face the color of wet concrete, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping, desperate, terrified. His lips were turning blue at the edges. Pulmonary embolism. She could see it in the pressure of his veins, the desperate mechanics of his breathing, the way his fingers clawed at his chest as if he could rip the blockage out himself. Get the surgical team, one of the residents stammered. They can't get here, Elena said quietly. The lockdown meant the surgical team was trapped 2 floors below during a facility's inspection. The lockdown meant no helicopters. The lockdown meant the window between consciousness and clinical death was about 90 seconds and getting narrower. Elena looked at Dr. Pierce's face. At the terror in his eyes as his body betrayed him. At the man who had just spent 3 days demolishing her professionally, publicly, systematically, now unable to do anything except die. She thought of her daughter at home. Of Captain James Martinez in room 347 watching his own death in slow motion through a window. Of the mission parameters that had been crystal clear: maintain deep cover, monitor the patient for emerging memories of bioweapon exposure, report only to her Pentagon handler. Blowing her cover meant mission failure. 3 years of careful construction, gone. The Pentagon losing eyes on classified information. Everything she'd sacrificed to be invisible, suddenly visible. She thought of all of that in exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at the crash cart. At the seal that indicated no one had accessed it since the last inspection. At the defibrillator pad sitting in their sterile packaging. At the medications that could restart what was stopping. The choice wasn't really a choice. It was just which version of herself she was going to let live. Elena's hand moved to the crash cart seal and broke it with a decisive crack that echoed through the corridor like the sound of something significant shattering. The alarm started as a whisper. Then it became a scream. Code Silver. Active threat in the parking structure. The overhead intercom crackled with the clinical precision of someone who'd trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times, but Elena heard what nobody else did beneath the words, the slight acceleration in the dispatcher's breathing. Real threat. Not a drill. The ER doors locked with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like something dying slowly. Hospital lockdown meant exactly what it said, sealed. Nobody in. Nobody out. The fluorescent light seemed to press down harder, casting everything in that particular hospital white that made blood look darker and fear look reasonable. Elena was reaching for a medication cart when the second alert came through. Surgical team. They'd been 2 floors up in the East Wing during a routine facilities inspection when the lockdown triggered. Trapped. The elevators had automatically returned to the ground floor. The stairwells were now restricted access. Protocol. Standard hospital protocol that suddenly mattered because the surgical team was 12 minutes away from any emergency intervention and 3 minutes away from being completely unreachable. She didn't process this as information that affected her. She processed it as a mathematical problem. 12 minutes to reach the ER. 3 minutes before access locks completely. And somewhere in that arithmetic, someone was going to need immediate surgical intervention and there would be nobody available to provide it. The ER erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses moved with the precision of people who drilled this scenario. Trauma bay doors locked. Visitors herded into the cafeteria. Security swept the corridors with the deliberate movements of people searching for threats they hoped not to find. Elena stayed exactly where she was, hand steady, mind running calculations that nobody else could hear. That was when Dr. Pierce collapsed. He was standing near the main desk, reviewing a chart with the usual expression of someone performing authority for an audience that wasn't paying attention. His face changed first, a subtle shift, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. Elena noticed. She'd been trained to notice the exact moment a human body decided it was going to fail. It happened in the eyes. A flicker. A recognition that something fundamental had broken. His hand went to his chest. Not clutching. Just touching, the way someone might touch a wall to verify it was real. Then his knees gave. The chart scattered. His body went down in stages, a controlled fall that suggested his mind was still trying to negotiate with gravity even as his body was surrendering to something far more immediate. Pulmonary embolism. She knew this before anyone said it. The color pattern, the way his lips were turning that particular shade of blue that meant oxygen starvation was happening fast, the way his hand was still moving like he was trying to claw something back from inside his own chest. Massive PE. The kind that doesn't leave time for thinking. Get the crash cart, someone shouted. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never actually had to crash a patient before. Elena did not move. She stood perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. This was the calculation. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Pierce had spent the last 72 hours systematically destroying her. He'd read her fabricated write-up in front of the entire morning huddle. He'd poisoned every relationship she'd built. He'd made it impossible for her to be in the same room without staff finding reasons to leave. He'd taken her 3 years of careful, invisible work and turned it into a liability. She could let him die. The thought arrived with the force of inevitability. Let the system work. Call for help that wouldn't arrive in time because the surgical team was locked behind access doors. Watch the code fail for natural reasons. Nobody would question it. Lockdown protocols were clear. In a containment situation, resources were finite. The trembling started in her hands. Not fear. Restraint. The exact same trembling that came before she'd breached a compound in Sanjin Valley. The physical manifestation of a decision being made at the cellular level. She broke the crash cart seal with a sound like something significant shattering. Her voice dropped. It didn't raise. Didn't get louder. Just dropped down into the register that belonged to someone who'd spent 3 tours running field hospitals under mortar fire. You bag him. You draw up epi. Move. Now. It wasn't a request. The resident scrambled. Not because she outranked them. Because something in her voice suggested that the next person who hesitated would face consequences worse than whatever was about to happen to Pierce. This was the tone of someone who triaged dying soldiers by pointing at them once and saying go. Just that. Go. And they went because survival instinct recognized authority when it heard it. She was already moving. 14-gauge needle. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done this in the dark under fire with contaminated water running down her arms. She'd done it on soldiers who'd already lost too much blood. She'd done it because the alternative was unacceptable. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Cistern decompression. Oxygen saturation started climbing. 75. 82. 88. The color returning to Pierce's face happened in stages, like someone was painting him back into existence. But his heart wasn't restarting. The residents were frozen, waiting for the next instruction. No surgical team. No cardiologist. Just a nurse and a patient, and the understanding that what happened in the next 60 seconds would be the difference between a body and a person. Elena's hand moved to the trauma bay drawer. Sterile field kit. She'd done this once before. Once. During a 2013 ambush outside Helmand Province, when a 75th Ranger Regiment medic took shrapnel and the aid station was 6 kilometers away and there was no choice between protocol and living. Open cardiac massage. Through the left anterolateral thoracotomy. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator. Scalpel. Incision. Muscle memory made conscious. This was the part where she stopped being someone's nurse and started being what she actually was. The residents watched her hands move and understood they were watching something that existed far outside the boundaries of their training. Ribs. Sternum. The cavity opened like something that had been waiting to be accessed. She found his heart. Took it in her hand. She'd held 3 soldiers' hearts in her hand before. She knew the weight of them. She knew how they felt when they were beating and how they felt when they weren't. She squeezed. Rhythm. Color. The pupils reacting to light stimulus. The body remembering how to live. Pierce's eyes opened. He was gasping. Actually gasping. Conscious. Present. His eyes focused on her, and she watched the moment his mind caught up to the fact that he was alive. She watched him recognize her. She watched something shift in his expression that suggested he understood, at a level deeper than conscious thought, exactly what had just happened. She let go. Stepped back. Stripped off her gloves without breaking eye contact. Around them, the residents were standing in absolute stillness. The kind of silence that only happened when someone realized they'd just witnessed a miracle performed by hands that didn't belong to a doctor. Secure his airway, Elena said to nobody in particular. Get him stable. Surgical teams locked behind the East Wing access doors, but code still active. They'll get through. She was already walking away. The trembling came now. Not fear. Never fear. The trembling that came after. The physical aftershock of having made a choice that nobody else could have made and nobody else could have survived intact. She kept her hands in her pockets as she walked. Small detail. Nobody would notice. Just a nurse needing a moment. Behind her, she heard one of the residents whisper, "Who was that?" The question hung in the air like something unanswered. Elena kept walking. She could feel Pierce's eyes on her back. Conscious now. Alive now. And probably already calculating. Already understanding that he'd just been saved by hands that had the muscle memory of someone who'd done this before. Many times before. The lockdown would last another 47 minutes. The surgical team would reach Pierce in 31 of those minutes. He would live. He would recover. And he would wake up tomorrow knowing that the nurse he'd spent the last 72 hours destroying had just chosen to let him live. But that wasn't the worst part. The crash cart seal snapped under her fingers. Crack. One sound. That's all it took to burn 3 years of careful invisibility to ash. The surgical team was still 2 floors away. Lockdown protocols meant the stairwells were sealed. Dr. Pierce's pulmonary embolism wasn't going to wait for bureaucracy. His blood pressure was 68/40. His oxygen sat was dropping past 82. The monitor beeped its accelerating death song, too fast, too desperate, the rhythm of a body shutting down one organ system at a time. Elena moved. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just muscle memory from Helmand Province, from field hospitals under mortar fire, from nights when the difference between living and dying was muscle memory and nothing else. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her voice didn't ask. It commanded. The residents froze. That wasn't a nurse's voice. That was the voice of someone who'd done this when the only anesthesia was adrenaline and the only surgical light was a headlamp duct taped to a helmet. She found the space between his ribs. The needle slid home. The hiss of air escaping, that beautiful, terrible hiss that meant the pressure was releasing, meant his collapsed lung could re-inflate, meant another 30 seconds of life before the next crisis arrived. The residents watched her hands. Steady. Precise. The kind of steady that comes from having done this on a stretcher in a dust storm while incoming rounds punched holes in the canvas overhead. Her fingers moved like she was reading Braille on the edge of catastrophe, finding every angle by feel alone. The O2 sat climbed. 82, 85. 88, Pierce gasped. His eyes opened. Recognition flickered across his face, not gratitude. Something else. The look of a man watching his executioner volunteer to save his life. The surgical team burst through the doors 2 minutes later. The attending surgeon took one look at Pierce's chest, at the needle, at the placement that was textbook perfect for field medicine but catastrophically illegal for a registered nurse, and his jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. He just took over. But the residents had already seen. They'd watched Elena perform a procedure that belonged in a trauma bay under anesthesia, and they'd watched her do it in the ER hallway with nothing but clinical precision and a woman-shaped hole in all their assumptions about who she was. By evening, Pierce was extubated and stable. By morning, he was on the phone from his hospital bed. Elena didn't see the calls being made. She was home, showering the dried blood from her scrubs, standing under water hot enough to turn her skin red, watching pink-tinged water spiral down the drain. But she felt the machinery beginning to turn. The way you feel a storm building on the horizon, not a cloud yet, just a pressure change in the air. Dr. Pierce had 3 board members' personal cell phone numbers. Men who'd hired him 5 years ago because he had credentials from Johns Hopkins and a last name that sounded like old money. Men who owed him favors. Men who understood that certain problems could be solved quietly if you had the right leverage and the right connections. His first call came at 7 a.m. I need you to pull an employment file. Elena Martinez. RN. I need to verify her original credentials through the sources she listed. Her nursing license, her undergraduate records, everything. The administrator he called knew what that meant. Verification through the sources meant calling the numbers she'd provided. Calling them and discovering that the Army Medical Command office in San Antonio existed only as a secure Pentagon extension that went nowhere. Calling the Credential Verification Service and finding that the reference numbers didn't track. Calling 3 universities and finding records of an Elena Martinez who'd graduated, but no academic file, no transcripts, nothing that a private investigator could use to build a case. Which meant she was lying. Which meant the hospital had a nurse practicing without verified credentials. Pierce's second call was to a private investigation firm he'd used before. Discreet. Thorough. The kind of firm that knew how to request records without asking questions that might land them in legal gray areas. I need a full background investigation. Focus on employment history gaps. I need to know where she was during the years not accounted for. I need every address, every reference, every job application. Something doesn't add up. His third call went to the board president at home on a Saturday morning. We have a problem. I have documentation that our ER nurse, Elena Martinez, has misrepresented her credentials. She performed procedures last night that are well outside her scope of practice. Emergency measures, yes, but the underlying issue is that she may not be a licensed nurse at all. I'm initiating an investigation. I wanted the board to hear it from me first. By noon, the investigation had started. By 2 p.m., termination papers were being drafted. By 4 p.m., hospital security was walking Elena out of the building. She didn't fight it. That's what made it worse, she just walked. Handed over her badge. The laminated photo of her smiling, wearing the carefully constructed lie of a competent but unremarkable nurse. Handed it over to the security officer, who wouldn't meet her eyes because everyone knew what Pierce had orchestrated and everyone understood that she'd saved his life and he'd repaid her by burning her down. She drove home in her scrubs. The blood was gone, but the smell of antiseptic had soaked into the fabric. She'd showered at the hospital before leaving but had put the scrubs back on out of habit. The armor that had protected her for 3 years now marked her as the woman who'd been fired. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Professional positioning. Even in her car, in isolation, her muscle memory kept her in formation. Her daughter was sitting at the kitchen table when Elena walked in at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon when she should have been in the ER until 7. The lunchbox was on the counter, unopened. Homework spread across the table, untouched. Her daughter looked up and saw her mother in scrubs at the wrong time and knew immediately that something had broken. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Elena sat down. The chair scraped against the tile floor. She opened her mouth. No words came. What could she say? That she'd saved a man's life and he'd responded by destroying her? That she'd broken a 3-year cover to maintain her honor and in doing so had burned the only thing protecting her daughter from questions that couldn't be answered? That somewhere in a Pentagon office, her handler was reading a report that would end more than her career. She pulled her daughter close instead. Held her. Let the kid's hair brush against her chin while outside the afternoon sun moved across the kitchen counter. The lunchbox still unopened. The homework still scattered. The world still turning like none of this mattered. That evening, Elena sat alone in the dark of her bedroom. The faded unit patch was in her hands. The one sewn into the jacket lining. Special Forces, 160th SAW Support, the dates hand-stitched in thread that had faded from black to grey. 23 years of service. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. And this patch, small enough to hide in a jacket, significant enough to end her life if anyone with authority discovered she was still active. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number that didn't exist in her contacts. Didn't even have a name. Just a string of encrypted numbers. Explain deviation. Mission parameters remain. Handler requesting debrief. 0400 hours. For in the morning. She had 6 hours to figure out what to say to a Pentagon official about how she'd let a mute veterans commanding officer watch the unit patch that connected her identity to him. How she'd broken protocol for medical heroics. How the cover that had taken 3 years to construct was now tissue paper. She touched the patch again. The faded letters. Captain Elena Martinez. Helmand Province, 2009. The night that changed everything. The night she'd carried the commanding officer's body out of an ambush. The night she'd held him while the medics worked and prayed that he'd survive. And now, 13 years later, that same man was lying in a hospital bed upstairs from her, unable to speak, unable to tell anyone that the woman who'd just been fired was the one who'd saved his life in a place where names got buried with the bodies and memories got classified so deep that even the people who lived them weren't supposed to acknowledge they existed. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Acknowledge. Status. Elena looked at the unit patch. The faded thread. The weight of it in her palm. She'd spent 3 years as just a nurse. Unremarkable. Competent. Invisible. She'd watched Captain James Martinez suffer in silence while her cover protected him. She'd let Dr. Pierce humiliate her in break rooms and in front of families. She'd swallowed insults and kept her voice deferential and her hands gentle and her eyes down. And in one moment of medical necessity, she'd burned it all down. She typed back, cover compromised. Medical emergency. Patient critical. No choice. Awaiting orders. The response came in seconds. Standing by. Send location coordinates 0400. Extraction protocol initiating. Extraction. They were pulling her out. Ending the mission, abandoning the cover, sending someone to get her and Captain Martinez before the FBI, the local police, the hospital board, or anyone else who'd been asking questions started getting answers that led to classified files and sealed records. But not until 4 in the morning. Until then, Elena sat in the dark with her faded patch and tried to figure out how to tell her daughter that they might not be coming back to Colorado Springs. At 9 a.m. sharp, the hospital's routine background refresh ran its algorithm across every employee file in Seattle General's database. Elena was in the break room, the actual break room now, not hiding anymore, when her phone buzzed. Not her burner. Her real one. The encrypted message contained only 3 words and a timestamp, flagged. Incoming. Now. Her security clearance. The one buried 7 levels deep in Pentagon servers. The one that was never supposed to surface in a civilian hospital system. But some routine federal audit, some automated cross-check, some bureaucratic domino that had been waiting 3 years to fall, had connected the dots. The cascade was already moving. In Colorado Springs, that meant military. That meant fast. By noon, a Marine colonel walked through Seattle General's main entrance. Not emergency, not urgent in the theatrical sense. Just a man in dress blues who moved through the corridor like he owned it. Like the air itself knew to step aside. His shoes clicked on the tile with the precision of a metronome. Each step sounded like a decision that had already been made. He carried a single file folder, manila and thick, and his jaw was set like a clamped vice. The termination hearing had been scheduled for the conference room on the 3rd floor. Elena sat at one end of a long table with 4 hospital board members on either side, the ones Dr. Pierce had called in, the ones who'd heard his whispered allegations about fabricated credentials and concerning employment gaps. They were ready to end her. Papers already drafted. Her security badge already deactivated. The machinery of institutional power working exactly as designed. Dr. Pierce stood at the head of the table in his white coat, his face flushed with the certainty of a man about to destroy someone weaker than himself. He'd already calculated the optics. She'd lied. She'd deceived the hospital. She'd endangered patients by exceeding her scope of practice. The board members were nodding. One of them had a pen poised over a termination letter. Then the colonel entered. The room didn't just go quiet. The quiet was so complete it had texture, weight, the kind of silence that comes right before a detonation. He didn't introduce himself. He simply opened the folder and laid photographs across the table. Elena in desert fatigues. Elena with medical equipment in conditions that looked like a forward operating base. Elena with a casualty in her arms, blood on her scrubs, her face focused with the intensity of someone saving a life under fire. Captain James Martinez, the mute veteran, the patient Elena had been assigned to monitor, the man who'd been wheeled to the hearing in a wheelchair, suddenly whispered 2 words that had never come from his mouth since the ambush in Helmand Province took his voice. Reaper 6. Elena's call sign. The name that meant something only to people who'd been there. Only to people who understood what it took to keep that many people alive while rounds were incoming. Only to people who'd seen the kind of courage that didn't announce itself. The colonel's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Captain Elena Martinez. Bronze Star with Valor. The board members' pens froze. Purple Heart. Dr. Pierce's face went the color of old bone. Treated 43 combat casualties under sustained enemy fire. The colonel's eyes moved across each board member, while personally eliminating 3 combatants threatening her aid station. The numbers hung in the air like ammunition. 43. 3. The difference between a nurse and a soldier. The difference between a job and a calling written in blood and training and decisions made in the fraction of a second when someone's life depends on your hands moving faster than your fear. Then the doors opened again. This time, a 2-star general entered in dress uniform. His medals covered half his chest. He moved to Elena and rendered a salute, a formal, deliberate gesture of respect, directly to the faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining she'd been wearing for 3 years. The patch that said everything about her that her cover had hidden. The patch that meant she'd walked through hell and come out the other side still carrying people. Dr. Pierce made his mistake then. The fatal one. His voice came out shaky, desperate, the sound of a man watching his narrative collapse in real time. These documents are fabricated. I have evidence of her deception. Sealed records, false credentials, she's. He stopped because the FBI agents entered. 2 of them. They moved with the mechanical precision of people whose job was to deliver bad news and not care about the reception. The senior agent stepped forward with a warrant in one hand and the kind of expression that meant he'd been waiting for this moment. Dr. Pierce, we've been monitoring your attempts to access Captain Martinez's sealed military record since your first illegal inquiry 3 days ago. The agent's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Every database search you ran. Every call you made to federal contacts. Every attempt to access files that are classified above your clearance level. All of it logged. All of it traced. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened. No sound came. You're under arrest for unauthorized access to classified government records and attempted falsification of federal documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The handcuffs gleamed under the conference room's fluorescent lights like surgical steel. Cold. Practical. Inevitable. The sound they made when the agent clicked them closed was final in a way that made board members flinch. Pierce's face went from white to red to a color that looked like surrender. I was trying to protect this hospital. She lied about who she was. The general's voice dropped to absolute zero. Captain Martinez was under orders. You were under investigation. 90 seconds. That's how long it took for the perp walk from the conference room down through Seattle General's main corridor. Elena watched from the doorway. Watched him past the nurses' station where her colleagues stood with their mouths open, the same ones who'd abandoned her when Dr. Pierce poisoned the break room against her. Watched him past the break room itself where staff whispered behind their hands, finally understanding that they'd chosen the wrong person to fear. They passed room 347 where Captain James Martinez sat in his wheelchair, watching. He nodded once. One small gesture. The kind of acknowledgement that came from someone who understood the cost of standing alone and being right about it. The local news crew caught the whole thing. Pierce loaded into an unmarked vehicle with his face covered. His medical license suspended within 48 hours. The state board opened a review of every case he'd supervised for 5 years. His wife didn't return his calls from holding. His attorney went silent. By the time he was processed, his professional references had stopped answering phones. Elena stayed at Seattle General for 2 more days to complete her statement, then transferred. Her actual assignment. The one that had been waiting for 3 years. The mission that had never really ended, just paused while she was undercover in this small Colorado Springs hospital, protecting one mute veteran and trying not to be extraordinary while the whole time she was carrying the weight of extraordinary inside her. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce taught CPR to bored teenagers at a community college for $15 an hour. His certification had been reduced to basic life support. His name appeared in medical ethics seminars as a cautionary tale about institutional arrogance and federal crimes. The gymnasium where he taught smelled like old sweat and rubber. A student played on their phone during his chest compression demonstration. He didn't correct them. He didn't have the authority anymore. Meanwhile, Elena briefed field operatives at Langley. Captain's bars polished. Her role in intelligence medicine formalized and expanded. She walked through classified corridors with the kind of presence that made other people move out of her way without being asked. Her military ID, the one piece of proof that had been hidden inside her jacket lining for 3 years, now displayed openly on her office desk. Beside it, a photograph of her son and Captain James Martinez in Helmand Province, both in Special Forces gear, both smiling in the Afghan sun before the ambush that changed everything. Captain Martinez's voice came back slowly. Therapy, treatment, but mostly it was because Elena's cover break allowed the Pentagon to provide classified medical intervention for bioweapon exposure. The kind of exposure that had stolen his voice in the first place. Word by word, sentence by sentence, he recovered. At a Medal of Honor ceremony in Washington, Martinez in dress uniform knelt to speak to Elena's 10-year-old daughter, who wore her mother's faded unit patch pinned to her dress. "Your mother saved my life twice," he said, his voice steady after 3 years of silence. Once in Afghanistan when she performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while under enemy fire. And once when she reminded me what courage looks like when no one's watching. The daughter beamed. Elena stood nearby in her army dress uniform, the bronze star and purple heart visible on her chest, no longer hidden. A junior officer approached with a question about maintaining cover in deep operations. Elena touched her daughter's shoulder and looked at the young officer with quiet dignity. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. That's the story of Captain Elena Martinez, who spent 3 years as a nurse in Colorado Springs protecting a veteran most people would never understand. The one who broke protocol to save a man who'd tried to destroy her. The one who carried her military identity like a secret weapon, waiting for the moment when being quiet and capable would finally be enough to stand against institutional arrogance. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, like this video. If you've ever had to watch someone try to tear you down without breaking, subscribe. And tell us in the comments, would you have saved Dr. Pierce if you'd been in Elena's position?